All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to talk about a word you use all the time, a concept so simple you probably don't even think about it. But what if I told you it's actually the secret foundation for, well, everything you think you know? We are talking about assumptions.
So what is an assumption, really? At its heart, it's just something you decide is true, without needing any proof. And look, we do this constantly, every single day. You assume the grocery store is going to be a nightmare on Saturday, so you go on a Tuesday instead. You assume your friend's swamped with work, so you decide not to call. They're basically the mental shortcuts we need to just get through life.
It's really easy to see them that way, right? Like, it's a failure to do your homework, to get all the facts. But what if that's completely wrong? What if I told you that without assumptions, you literally could not have logic or science or philosophy? What if they aren't some bug in our thinking, but the most fundamental feature of how we build knowledge itself?
That's right. Far from being lazy, assumptions are the secret architects of pretty much everything we know. They're the starting blocks. They are the non-negotiable foundations that we build everything on, from complex mathematical proofs all the way to our deepest understanding of the universe.
You know, in the worlds of math and logic, they have a special name for these kinds of foundational assumptions. They call them axioms. The ancient geometer Euclid, for instance, started with just a few basic ideas, like a straight line can be drawn between any 2 points. He didn't prove it. He just said, let's assume this is true. And from that tiny handful of axioms, he built the entire field of geometry.
And in philosophy, you find the exact same concept, but they call it a first principle. It's a truth so foundational, so basic, that you can't possibly derive it from anything else. And for centuries, thinkers from Aristotle all the way to modern physicists have been on this quest to find these ultimate, irreducible truths about reality. And that leads us to probably the most famous first principle in all of history, the philosopher René Descartes. He decided he was going to doubt everything he possibly could, the sky, his own hands, everything. But he realized there was one thing he couldn't doubt, the fact that he was the one doing the doubting. His thought, I think, therefore I am, became his ultimate, unprovable starting point for everything else. Now, some other fields take this idea and run with it in a totally different direction. The economist Milton Friedman, for example, made this famous argument that it doesn't even matter if an economic model's assumptions are realistic. The only question that matters is, does the model make accurate predictions? This shows you a whole different purpose for assumptions. Their job isn't always to be true, but to be useful.
Okay, so we've established that all our big systems of knowledge are built on these foundational assumptions. But that leads to a pretty terrifying question. What happens when we try to prove the foundations themselves? This, my friends, is where we run smack into a huge paradox. See, anytime you try to prove something, you're taking on what's called the burden of proof. You're saying, I have the evidence. But how can you possibly provide evidence for your most basic assumption? Think about it. Any evidence you use would already rely on that same assumption. You can't prove a ruler is accurate by measuring it with that same ruler. It just doesn't work.
This whole quest for an ultimate final proof leads us straight into a famous philosophical trap known as the Munchausen trilemma. It's named after this fictional German baron who supposedly got out of a swamp by pulling himself up by his own hair, which is just a perfect metaphor for this logical impossibility of trying to prove a foundational belief from inside its own system. So the trilemma says that any attempt to find that ultimate proof is going to fall into one of three traps. First, there's infinite regress. That's the endless why game. You prove A with B, but then you have to prove B with C and then C with D, and it just goes on forever. You never hit bottom. Second, you have circular reasoning, the snake eating its own tail. You try to prove A using B, but it turns out your proof for B is A. You've just gone in a big circle. And the third trap, a dogmatic assertion. You basically just stop and say, this is true because I said so. But that's not a proof, is it? That's just an unproven assumption, which is exactly where we started.
Okay, so if we're stuck with assumptions and we can't ever really prove them, what are we supposed to do? Well, we get smart about how we choose them. The goal isn't to have zero assumptions. That's impossible. The goal is to have good ones. So let's look at a couple of really powerful tools for thinking this through.
Here are two fantastic mental models for picking better assumptions. On one hand, you have Occam's razor. This is all about simplicity. It basically says, all things being equal, you should go with the explanation that requires the fewest new assumptions. On the other hand, you have a totally different tool, the least dangerous assumption. This one isn't about simplicity. It's about ethics. It asks a really crucial question. If I'm wrong, which assumption will cause the least amount of harm?
And that second tool has some incredibly powerful real-world consequences. This principle actually started in the field of special education. Teachers face this choice. Should I assume a nonverbal student is competent or that they're incompetent? Well, the least dangerous assumption is to always presume competence. And why is that? Because it is far, far less damaging to a child's future to assume they can learn and be wrong than it is to assume they can't learn and be right.
So, where does all of this leave us? I mean, we started with a really simple definition, and now we're questioning the very idea of proof itself. It kind of forces us to face the power and really the necessity of the unprovable.
If there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. Every single system of knowledge we have, from science and math to our own personal beliefs about the world, it all rests on a bedrock of assumptions we can never ultimately prove. We're not building on a solid foundation of proof, we're building on a foundation of chosen belief. In a strange way, it's all built on a kind of faith.
This is the classic fancy Latin way of stating Occam's razor. It means plurality should not be posited without necessity. It's just a powerful reminder that if all our knowledge is built on the beliefs we choose to start with, then we have a huge responsibility to choose simple, clear, elegant ones. Where we start from matters a lot.
And that brings us to our final and maybe most challenging question. If ultimate proof is a logical swamp we can never actually escape, what does that mean for the very concept of truth? Could it be that what we call truth is simply the most useful, the most predictive, or maybe the least dangerous story that we've all agreed to tell ourselves?